The second impeachment trial of President Trump will begin the week of February 8th. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced the schedule on Friday. He agreed to give the former commander-in-chief a 2-week delay to prepare a defense against the charge that he incited the attack on the Capitol earlier this month. The House will still submit the article of impeachment against Mr. Trump on Monday to begin the formal process. CBS's Natalie Brandt has the details.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced she will send the article of impeachment against former President Donald Trump to the Senate on Monday evening. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says the Senate trial won't start until the week of February 8th.
Healing and unity will only come if there is truth and accountability, and that is what this trial will provide.
Minority Leader Mitch McConnell had pushed for a delay.
The sequel cannot be an insufficient Senate process that denies former President Trump his due process or damages the Senate or the presidency.
This week, Mr. Trump's GOP Senate allies announced he has hired South Carolina lawyer Butch Bowers to anchor his defense. Several Republicans in the Senate have already come out against an impeachment trial for former President Trump, arguing it may be unconstitutional.
A post-presidential impeachment's never occurred in the history of the country for a reason, that it's unconstitutional.
There's nothing in the text of the Constitution that prohibits an impeachment trial under these circumstances.
Georgetown University law professor David Super is among legal scholars who argue Congress does have the authority to impeach and convict a former president.
If he is convicted on impeachment by 2/3 vote of the Senate then can vote again to impose a lifetime disqualification.
For a conviction, at least 17 Senate Republicans would have to join the chamber's 50 Democrats. Natalie Brandt, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
To dig further into the topic of President Trump's second impeachment, Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Lessig joins us again. Lawrence, please give us some insight into what the president and his lawyers are doing in these next 2 weeks before the trial.
There are really two things they need to accomplish. First, they need to establish the factual predicate that they believe the president did not incite the criminal riot on Capitol Hill. But the second thing they'll be doing is trying to sustain the argument that, in fact, a president cannot be impeached after he's left office. And I think that second argument is not true, but that's absolutely what they will try to do.
All right, let's take those one by one. Let's start off with the first argument. Do Democrats need to prove that President Trump's intent was to start an insurrection? And how would witnesses provide that proof in this trial?
Well, we're beginning to see a lot of facts that make it clear that they certainly intended there to be a very vigorous protest outside of the Capitol, at least. The Republican Party paid close to $3 million to help organize the event on January 6th. And the president's language was as clear as it could be, that they should move to Capitol Hill and make the noise that would lead Congress to do something. And the question is, what did they want Congress to do? And it seems a little unbelievable that they didn't want Congress to respond in the way that apparently the president thought that they should respond, which is to violate the law by reversing the results that came out of the electoral process in the states. So I think that the facts here are pretty clear that the president was at least reckless, criminally reckless, about what he did in inducing the behavior that eventually led to that riot. And I think as more of the evidence comes out, we'll see that it was not so much of a surprise as things began to fall apart.
Interesting, because what I'm hearing from you now is that this idea of insurrection doesn't necessarily mean that he wanted his supporters to break into the Capitol, but he did want to overturn the lawful results of the election, which in and of itself could count as insurrection. So if their argument was we only wanted them to protest, which is, of course, provided for in the U.S. Constitution, that could still lead the Democrats to say, yes, but you wanted them to cause this action, which is illegal, the overturning of the election results. Is that what I'm understanding from you?
Well, you know, it's very clear that the morning of January 6th, the president was still trying to get the vice president to overturn the results in the Electoral College by ruling against the slates of electors from key states. So it's quite clear his belief was that those actors on Capitol Hill could be incentivized or pressured or convinced to flip the results against the legal results in this election. And that's the critical point. There's no doubt that Joe Biden was legally elected president. There was a lot of talk about unfair balloting processes and fraud at the ballots and all that stuff, but that had all been resolved legally before January 6th. And on January 6th, there was no legal basis for anyone to question Congress confirming Joe Biden as president. And Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, as they led the opposition, had no legal right to do so because the law didn't give them the right to question those results once the states had certified them. So the president thought he could get a different result. His people were pushing for a different result. They were trying to use thousands of people marching on Capitol Hill to create that pressure. I think they're responsible for the consequences of that extremely criminally reckless behavior.
Let's get into the second part of the argument. Senator Lindsey Graham tweeted that he believes that post-presidential impeachments are, quote, blatantly unconstitutional. I know that this is a bit of murky ground. What do we know about the ability of the Senate to actually convict a president after they have left office? And what purpose does it serve to do so?
Well, it's certainly true, as Lindsey Graham said, that we've never seen a president convicted after he's left office. The closest case would have been Nixon. But the critical point is there would have been no reason to convict Nixon because Nixon couldn't run again. He had already been elected twice and so therefore was already disqualified from running for president. So it's true it hasn't happened, but it's also true that it has happened in offices that were not the presidency. So in 1876, William Belknap, who was the Secretary of War, resigned just before Congress was about to impeach him. But then he was eventually impeached and he was tried after he had left office. And the reason that makes sense is that you can't allow these officers to basically escape any consequences for their bad behavior simply by stepping aside in time to avoid the reach of the hand of the law here. So the history and the text of the Constitution support the tradition that says it's certainly possible for the Senate to continue to try President Trump after he's no longer president. And of course, he can't force him to be removed because he's already gone. But it's certainly possible if they convict for the Senate then by a majority vote to decide that he's not eligible to run again.
Lawrence, one last question for you. The New York Times is reporting a member of the Justice Department was working with President Trump to remove acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen in order to overturn the Georgia runoff election. Going to your point initially about insurrection, not necessarily just being people breaking into the Capitol, but trying to overturn those election results, I'm wondering, can this be used against President Trump in the impeachment trial?
Well, I think the fact that he is illegally attempting to change the results certainly can be used against him. I mean, the most extraordinary part of that story in the New York Times was the call that the leading members of the Justice Department had, where they were asked, what will you do if, in fact, Rosen is fired? And they all said, we would resign. And it's the fact that they finally stood up to the president and drew a line that stopped the president from taking that extraordinary action. So I think the president in his head believed he was entitled, perhaps, but it was a completely baseless belief. He was not entitled to attempt to overturn those results. And I think what he did in the Justice Department confirms what he was trying to do with Mike Pence, which was to get him to act against the Constitution and the law to force a different result than what the people had expressed.
All right. Lawrence Lessig, thank you.
Thank you.